What's going on, guys? Brent0331. I got my good buddy Bruce at Camp Armament. Be sure to check out his channel. And we got a new Vietnam gear, weapons, and equipment video for you guys covering Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observation Group, MACV-SOG. And guys, if you have not seen or gone over to like the Jocko podcast and watched those interviews with John Stryker Mayer or the SOGcast interviews that John Stryker Mayer is doing, and there's a lot of books that are coming out and have come out over the pretty recent years talking about MACV-SOG, because for a long time nobody knew anything really about it, right? Even the guys that served in Vietnam, you see these guys, they were launching and conducting what's called the secret war. They were in places that we weren't supposed to be. Cambodia, Laos. Why? Because the enemy was there. The enemy wasn't adhering to their agreements, and so we had to send recon teams in there and keep eyes on their movements down the Ho Chi Minh Trail that ran through those countries. So we've assembled a vast array of uniforms, gear, and equipment and weapons, and we're going to bring that to you guys today. We're going to hit the wave tops. Obviously, there's no way possible that we could cover every single little minute, nook and cranny that MACV-SOG carried and used. However, we spent the better part of a year assembling all this stuff, and we think we got a pretty good assortment of stuff to show you, so you guys have a pretty good idea of what they wore and used. So what you got, man?
Yeah, after a year of studying MACV-SOG, which is really probably my personally most favorite group within the Vietnam War. I know growing up, they were such a secretive group. They just made you crave more and more information about them. And now finally some of that information's out there with the advent of the internet, and we've got stories that can be put on the internet. Now veterans no longer have to write a book. They can just stick a camera in front of their face and start telling their stories, and we're starting to hear some rather unbelievable stories where these guys were in extremely dangerous situations in Vietnam. Entire units sometimes just disappeared. Just no one really knows what happened to them. Radio contact was broke and they were never heard from again. A lot of really dangerous rescue missions went down, and many other things, typically behind enemy lines in Laos and in Cambodia. And that was top secret stuff at the time that, we weren't supposed to be over there, but we were over there, and these were the guys that were doing it. And a lot of them have kept those stories to themselves till now, and we're finally starting to hear some of those stories. So I'm really excited about it. I know we put a lot of gear together. Like Brent said, we've got a lot of weapons. We're hoping that this will be another fantastic video on YouTube to show you guys some of the gear and equipment that they used, the more common gear and equipment that they had. Like Brent said, we can't cover everything, but we have a really good basic kit here that probably anyone who was in MACV-SOG will be familiar with the stuff that we're talking about today.
Absolutely. All right, guys, let's get started. First up, uniforms. So what did MACV-SOG operators use in country? Well, they used a whole bunch of stuff in short, and we're going to cover this. So first and foremost, the regular jungle fatigue uniform. Okay, this is essentially the standard uniform of American servicemen in Vietnam. One big caveat to that is that their uniforms would be sterile. What do I mean by that? Well, there would be no markings on the uniforms. There would be no unit insignias. The Army likes to throw patches on everything, right? To let you know who they are. They would not have unit patches. They would not have name tapes and things that would associate them as being Americans in those respective places. Again, they're not supposed to be there, okay? So this is the standard jungle uniform, and what those guys would do is they would make alterations to this uniform. And this is probably the most widely used uniform of those MACV-SOG guys, okay? But what do I mean by alterations? They would actually sew their own pockets on. They would add additional pockets to the uniform. Now again, they are a special operations unit, right? Most of these guys were special forces, commonly known as Green Berets, and they had the latitude to be able to wear those altered uniforms. And they would take pockets and they would sew them on the sleeves. A lot of times they would take, the lower pocket, add it to the sleeve, or in this case here, I took the top pocket, because it's a smaller pocket, from another jungle fatigue blouse and added it to the sleeves here. So now there's 4 pockets on the front. But they could take that down to the local mama-san, have them sew on, some additional pockets, maybe insert, And I've seen uniforms with pockets sewn on the inside, so they got hidden pockets with zippers. They would just have all kinds of additional tailor-made pockets added to these fatigues to hold the different gear that they needed to take on missions. And that was one thing that's very unique about MACV-SOG if you look at pictures of them while they're in country. And guys, you know, you look at this and it's like, you know, sleeves on, or pockets on sleeves. Well, hell, every single, you know, U.S. military blouse nowadays has pockets on sleeves. It's kind of the, you know, a known thing, right? It's a great alteration to the uniform, and it's what these guys were doing, you know, back in the day. And obviously, it, you know, paved the way for what we see nowadays in the modern uniform. Now, moving over here, another pretty common alteration that you would see is that they would have, you know, field-made camouflage. And that literally is just taking, you know, spray paint or any type of paint and just making their own camouflage to the solid olive drab utility uniform just to break it up. So that's what you see here. You know, we have the a modified, you know, jungle fatigue shirt, sleeves on the pockets, and you know, just literally just took some paint, covered it up there just to break up that, you know, that blob of green, right? Just give it some camouflaging principles to it with just some field expedient camouflage. And that is something you will see routinely if you're looking at MACV-SOG photos. You will see that a lot of those guys did do that. All right. Another pretty fairly common adaptation of the uniform is they would just take their regular jungle fatigues and they would dye them black. Now, a lot of you might be asking, you know, why on earth would they do that? Well, there's a couple reasons that, you know, I can think of, and I'm sure, you know, it makes sense at the time. You know, we're here in the woods in North Texas, okay? We don't have triple canopy jungle, all right? But if you're in the jungle in Southeast Asia, it's very dark. It's very dark under triple canopy jungle, and there's a lot of shadow, okay? So even though, you know, you always hear all the time, oh, black, it silhouettes you and everything else, you know, there is some truth to that. There is something to be said about wearing, you know, an all black jungle fatigues when you're in that type of environment. Why else would they do it? Well, look what I have over here. What is this? This is your typical, you know, Southeast Asia peasant style outfit that a lot of workers and stuff would wear. You see Viet Cong wearing black pajamas is what we typically refer to them as. And it's just a common type of outfit worn over there. If you're wearing all black dyed jungle fatigues from a distance, you know, that might buy you that extra second or two in a chance encounter with the enemy, and you might be able to get the drop on them. Because again, if you're operating in Cambodia or Laos, you know, the enemy's typically not expecting to run into Americans or these recon teams, because these recon teams obviously had some Vietnamese as well as Mountain Yard, you know, members on them, and you know, the enemy's not expecting to run into them. So if they do run into them, and they first thing they see is just, you know, person wearing black, they're probably thinking something like this, okay? And early on, before this was around, there's pictures of those guys even wearing stuff like this, and it would be made by CISO, and CISO is an operation in, I think it was Japan, out of Okinawa, and they made gear specifically for these types of operations. And a lot of this gear was designed so that it could be, hey, it's not American-made equipment, all right? And a lot of it was made to look like enemy equipment, all right? And another example of that would be, here's a representation of an NVA uniform of the time in the early years, obviously. And you know, if that's what the enemy was wearing, well, there was a CISO-produced uniform that looked a lot like this. And it kind of looked like a jungle fatigue shirt. It had the 4 pockets you guys are seeing the picture I'm putting up. And guys would wear that for the specific reason of, hey, maybe buying you that few precious seconds in a chance encounter with the enemy to get the drop on them, okay? If you just happen to stumble on the enemy, they see it, what is the first thing they see? They see a uniform that looks like theirs. They're in a place where there's not supposed to be Americans, and hey, might buy you that extra few seconds to get you out of that sticky situation. So that was another alteration that you commonly see with some of the MACV-SOG teams. So I'm going to kick it over to Bruce, and he's going to talk about some of the camouflage uniforms we got here.
So camouflage uniforms. First, we have to start with the earliest of the camouflage patterns that we really saw used by U.S. troops in Vietnam, and that was this duck hunter or biogam type pattern. This looks a lot like the pattern that you kind of probably think of being used in the Pacific War during World War II, and it was a very similar pattern. These were used by Special Forces advisors in the beginning of the war, and you continue to see them pop up on very limited numbers throughout the war. Don't have any photos of SOG actually using this in the field, but it's not beyond the realm of imagination that it could have happened, particularly earlier in the war. But as you can see, this isn't probably the best jungle pattern that we could have come up with, and pretty quickly you start to see adaptations of other patterns like our next pattern here, which is tiger stripe. Tiger stripe started being developed at the very beginning of the war as well. It went through different patterns. The stripes changed shape and width at times. The coloration could change due to how they were taken care of out in the field. And these are two examples that you can see would have both been worn side by side, but looked fairly different in color. These could be mixed matched also. These were not produced in the US, but were typically sourced in Southeast Asia or in Japan. And they were a favorite among special teams, including SOG. There's some discussion that SOG never wore these across the fence. That's not true. They typically did not, but there were a couple of operations where these were seen in Laos or Cambodia, and specifically they seem to be more popular with your indigenous troops, whether it be Montagnards or South Vietnamese that were attached to the SOG teams, than the American teams, or than the Americans. So speaking of the Americans, these were very commonly seen worn around base, in formation and things of that nature. So as long as they were in Vietnam, even common to see them among American troops. So these were problematic, the tiger striped uniforms. They weren't as well made as American stuff, and the quality wasn't quite there. The material wasn't as durable, and along comes your Erdl pattern camouflage. Now this was the first time that in Vietnam Americans had formally officially adopted a camouflage pattern to be used, made in the United States, used by American troops across the board. Army, Marines, and special teams adopted this as well. So it's not uncommon at all late war to see SOG units wearing partial Erdl camouflage uniforms or complete Erdl camouflage uniforms. These came in two basic variations. You had what we collectors refer to as green dominant, where you can see this lime green color in the material, and that was replaced with a more tan color, which is more reminiscent of the later woodland camouflage pattern. But these there's some discussion that these were designed to be issued in certain areas of Vietnam, but what we know actually happened in practice, they got issued indiscriminately. Troops wore them indiscriminately, sometimes mix and match, and to be honest, I doubt they noticed much difference between them. It was just a camouflage pattern, and once you're wet and sweaty in it, it doesn't really matter anyway. So lastly, let's look at the sleep shirt. I wanted to talk about the sleep shirt because this shirt was worn often as a warming layer. There were times in Vietnam, believe it or not, where it got quite cool and a warming layer may be desirable. It's easy to slip on, slip off. This is a military issue shirt. You see it used with pretty much all branches throughout the war. It pops up from time to time in photos, and SOG would have certainly had access to it as well. And there's also, we believe, a CISO produced version of this shirt. So let's look at headwear. Particularly, you're going to see a lot of boonies on this table because there were a lot of different variations of the boonie hat, but there's some other headwear as well that we're going to cover. We're going to knock it out pretty quick and try to keep it short and sweet because there's a lot of hats to cover, and again, it is just headwear. So first of all, we've got the standard issue boonie hat. Now this is an original issued, military issued Vietnam era boonie hat in pretty much mint condition. And you can see this one has got the tags in it. This was a hat that, just like anyone in the military on the ground would have access to and would have worn that hat. Very common to see among infantry units, but as well as SOG. This is another one, very similar. This one's got a little more wear on it. It just doesn't have any tags. It's just a sterile hat. But same basic design, production. This one's a little earlier because it's just a poplin, whereas this one's a rip stop. But same thing, same hat, just an olive green hat. Now, a lot of guys, as Brent mentioned before with the uniforms, would like to knock the green blob of their uniform down a little bit and break that up. So this is a boonie hat that's been oversprayed black. Sometimes they were dyed black. Sometimes they were sprayed, when I say oversprayed, using black spray paint, just to break up the overall green color of this boonie quite a bit. This was common among troops who were operating in areas of, like Brent said, triple canopy, or where it was wet and you had dark undergrowth, trees that had turned black from being wet, or shadows, dark shadow areas. Also, fair to mention, and we're going to get into that, is that darkening that uniform could make it look a little bit more like an enemy uniform. So let's look at these CISO made boonie hats. We've got a few of them here. Obviously, these are made out of black material. These are sort of similar to what you would see the VC wearing out in the field with their black boonie hats. So the idea behind these were they were durable and well made. They had foliage bands, usually sometimes sewn into them, vent holes, so they were of a higher quality than what the Viet Cong would wear. However, these hats looked from a few feet away just like a Viet Cong hat. Really popular among American troops as well as Vietnamese troops that were attached to the American troops. And you're going to see a common theme here as we go through these uniforms and gear. If you were an Asian featured person from Vietnam or maybe a Montagnard, you were attached to the MACV-SOG team and you were wearing what appeared from a few feet away to be an enemy uniform with enemy equipment, they probably would think you were an enemy and you would buy yourself that extra couple seconds you needed to get the drop on them. Here's another CISO boonie, and this has got the reflective panel in it, and you could use this for signaling other troops or signaling aircraft. This is a pretty common modification that you would see in boonie hats among special teams. Got your typical tiger stripe boonies here, a couple of different styles and types. These would come with different length brims. Sometimes they were cut down, sometimes they were made shortened, sometimes they were shortened by Mama-san over at the base. But common to see tiger stripe boonies. This would have been like a locally made boonie from Shelter Half. You would see a lot of locally made hats that were of variable designs employed by special teams like MACV-SOG. Here's another one made from parachute material. And that's actually a pretty cool hat. That would really short brim on that. Not uncommon to see special teams using a short brim, and that'd be a comfortable hat. I wouldn't mind wearing that myself. Now here is a US issue Erdl pattern boonie hat. Now, this is another original Vietnam era boonie hat that's basically unissued, and you can see how big that brim is. And sometimes you see SOG guys wearing them with the big brims. Again, sometimes you see them cut them down really short to where there's almost nothing there at all. The cravat, this is just a bandage that can be, it's a cotton material that can be used for making like arm slings and things of that nature. These were really common, really popular, and these were worn around the neck, like I've got this one here. They were worn around the head, like a bandana or a do-rag. Really common to see these used among SOG teams out in the field, for sure. That was a common piece of headwear. Berets. So we know that MACV-SOG was part of Special Forces, and Special Forces wore berets. Brett and I discussed this. We haven't seen a lot of photo evidence of these berets being worn in the field by MACV-SOG, like we did with LERPs in the previous LERP video. However, it's not beyond the realm to assume that MACV-SOG might have worn those around the base, and there might have been an instance or two where they got out in the field. We don't really have that much photographic evidence to substantiate that. And lastly, we've got enemy headwear. Again, something like this pith helmet that the NVA would have worn, this would be commonly worn by, I wouldn't say commonly, but you could see it worn by indigenous troops that had been attached to MACV-SOG, and every now and then you see a picture of an American wearing one of these as well. Not super common, but we know that it happened. This is an NVA boonie. Again, same idea, whether it was a captured boonie that troops decided to stick on their head and wear. You see a couple of examples of that, or if it was a CISO-made boonie designed to look like this enemy had out in the field. Those guys certainly employed those when the opportunity presented itself. Let's look at underwear, skivvies, things that you would wear underneath your clothes for comfort, which many times might not have been worn at all by these special teams. But here's a pair, a big boy pair of original Vietnam issue boxer shorts. It had a cotton material. There's a stamp there, size stamp, extra, extra large, 50 to 52. Now that is for a big boy. American size. Typically, underwear probably wouldn't have been worn. We know infantry troops just disposed of them and typically didn't wear them at all, would wear just their fatigue pants. But these were certainly available, and if someone wanted to wear them, this is what they would have issued to them, available to them. Undershirts, really the same thing is true too. A lot of the photos we look at, SOG team guys are not wearing undershirts. They're just wearing their fatigue top or camo top, whichever that they had. But these were available to them also. This is also an original. This is a very small size, but you can get an idea for what originals look like at the time. There were a few different styles of these, but this is certainly one of them. And it's just what you would think of today as a nice soft cotton t-shirt. Lastly, we've got socks. This is something that most troops would have certainly worn, although there are examples of soldiers going bare feet in their boots from time to time. But yeah, just a pair of military issue socks, and I haven't worn these myself. These are rather comfortable, I think, for a military issue pair of socks.
Belts, what did they wear around their trousers? So let's look at, I got a couple things laid out, right? So these are your typical standard issue US Army belts of the time. Obviously your MACV-SOG guys probably weren't wearing these. They had a lot of latitude, they could wear whatever they want, plus, you know, US Army issued equipment, you know, they try to minimize that, okay? So what was more likely? Well, there you had your typical regular civilian belts, which we know from doing our LERP video, a lot of the LERP guys would wear. So it goes to say that maybe MACV-SOG guys probably utilize some civilian belts as well. So that's definitely a possibility. What's more common than all that though? Cravats. So this may be pretty hard to believe for some, but they would actually use the cravat, just weave it in through the belt loops, come around, and then just tie it off. Very common belt, very quiet, right? And it's one more piece of medical equipment that you have, God forbid, if one of those guys gets wounded, which we all know, MACV-SOG guys, 100% casualties. If you join MACV-SOG, you were 100% guaranteed that you were going to be either wounded or killed. So that's how crazy their missions were, okay? Another revolutionary thing, I guess you could say, with the MACV-SOG world, that they, you know, is still a lasting thing on modern military uniforms. They would take these big straps that you guys see, you know, and these are essentially parachute straps, A7A straps for tightening down equipment. They would take something like this and cut it down, all right, and make a belt out of it. Just a normal size belt. And yeah, I mean, what does this look like to you? This looks like a modern day military riggers belt that is typically issued with both the United States Army and Marine Corps. So, you know, again, these guys were ahead of their times on a lot of stuff, and a lot of their modifications that they made to their uniforms are still prevalent in modern uniforms today. All right, so boots. Let's take a look at the boots. What was the most common boot worn by MACV-SOG? And that is undoubtedly the standard issue jungle boot. Now there's two very common variations of the jungle boot, and I'm not going to go down the long history of the jungle boot. That's for probably a different video. But the most common boot worn by MACV-SOG undoubtedly is going to be this variation of the jungle boot, which has what's called the Vibram sole. You see it has the V's on the bottom. This is the most commonly used jungle boot of the Vietnam War, hands down. Okay, now one special feature of these jungle boots that should be mentioned is these are actually spike protective. So what that means is they have a actual metal plate in the bottom of the boot designed to protect the wearer from the threat of punji sticks. So the punji sticks are, you know, what the Viet Cong and NVA would, you know, they build pits with punji sticks, these sticks in them, sharpened sticks. They'd smear them in shit and anything else, anything other vile that, you know, potentially can cause an infection. And they would put those down there, and then if a guy would fall in, you know, he'd be stabbed by those punji sticks. Might not necessarily kill them, but definitely maim them and probably cause an infection where he might later die. So the actual metal plate was inserted into the boots in this particular variation to help protect against that. Now, jungle boots are essentially tailor-made for that hot weather jungle environment. You guys can see the drain holes to help. So when these guys go through water, and you know, they're stepping, with every step it's going to start pushing that water out of those vent holes. Even the soles, as you guys can see, the soles here are designed to kind of act as like sponges to help push that water out of the boot. So these boots were fantastic for what they were intended to be, and are definitely just mainstay staples of the Vietnam War. Now, another variation of the jungle boot, which is a later war variation, it has a new sole. So this is commonly referred to as the Panama sole, and you guys can see the main difference there. Okay, this sole here was designed to help with pushing mud out. So when you step and you're walking through, you know, muddy environments, this sole actually helps push that and disperse that mud better. At least that's what I've heard, than this older Vibram sole style. Now, this Panama sole would stay in U.S. military circulation all the way into the early GWAT. I remember as a young Marine Lance Corporal crossing the LOD into Iraq in 2003, and I had a pair of desert jungle boots that still had this Panama sole on it, okay? Now, what about other footwear that possibly was worn by MACV-SOG? Well, we have, you know, we've talked about this theme quite a bit, about trying to confuse the enemy. Now, you guys saw in the intro video, we tried to convey a enemy hunter tracker team, NVA hunter tracker team, and they absolutely had those, trying to track down those MACV-SOG recon units in Laos and Cambodia. They used dogs, they used specifically trained trackers to try to get those guys. So one of the tricks that some of the MACV-SOG teams would have employed is they might have tried to use NVA issued boots. So this is kind of representative of typical NVA Army standard footwear, and if you were wearing the enemy's footwear, well, you're leaving a distinct boot print, right? You're leaving an NVA boot print as opposed to a U.S. Army footwear boot print. So it's very something that, you know, some recon teams could have employed. These are a pair of like Ho Chi Minh sandals, and I'm not saying any MACV-SOG guys would have ran around in that, but these are probably the two common footprints that the enemy would have been seeing in their AO along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. You know, very different than, you know, let's say that, right? So there's also some pictures floating around of like specifically designed soles that attached to the jungle boot that left the imprint of a, you know, a human foot. I don't know how much that was actually done, but it definitely was made and attempted at some point, but definitely wasn't in widespread circulation with the teams. So again, your standard, most common piece of footwear for MACV recon teams would definitely have been this variation of the jungle boot.
You'll notice in some photos that SOG teams, or at least some members of the teams, are wearing those tall khaki leggings like we saw in the Pacific in World War II. Those are the M1938 leggings, and SOG teams would wear those for several reasons. One, they give ankle support. They also protect from leeches and, of course, dirt and debris getting into your boots while you're out moving through wet and muddy terrain. Now, if you'll notice on these have been also lightly dusted with some black spray paint to help break up the overall outline of this solid tan material, just like they did with some of their uniforms and some of their hats. And we'll put a picture in here of a SOG team member wearing these same type of leggings that are also painted with the black spray paint.
All right, moving on to gloves. So Starting from the top, now I see a lot of civilian, at least it appears to be civilian variations of like leather style gloves worn by the MACV-SOG guys. And I think some of those may be some of the earlier leather flight gloves. So I'm talking like World War II, Korea era. I've got a couple examples of those laying out here. And again, I don't know for sure that those are what I'm seeing. Again, I'm sure civilian gloves are worn, but definitely, you know, if the guys got their hands on these, they might have worn some of these. But these are like World War II, Korean era leather style gloves. These are the type B3A, and then this one says HAU-6/P style leather gloves. And what a lot of those recon guys would do is, you know, take something like this, at least a leather style glove, and then cut off maybe the trigger finger and some other fingers on those gloves. Moving on here, very common glove that you see a lot. You know, we talked about these with the LERP teams in our previous video. But these are the M1949 leather gloves. Now these are kind of like a mainstay glove for infantrymen, just for doing work. But what you would see is that these recon guys would take these gloves, and then, you know, a lot of times they would just cut off the fingers, you know, again, trigger fingers or certain fingers that they wanted more dexterity with. And then they would use these gloves so that when you're going through that thick jungle vegetation in the, you know, triple canopy jungle, you know, your hands aren't getting all torn up. So definitely some benefit to wearing, you know, a thick leather glove like these M1949 style gloves. Another common glove, M1950s. These are pretty much for like rappelling, which we know the MACV-SOG guys, you know, they'd get extracted a lot of times on ropes and you know, stable harnesses and stuff. So, you know, they might be wearing a glove like this to help, you know, keep their hands from getting all jacked up. Last glove I'm gonna talk about is probably more of a late war, but that's your standard Nomex style flight glove. And again, they could either wear it with the fingers or for more dexterity, cut off some of the fingers on the gloves. All right, let's talk about camouflage face paint. So how did these guys camouflage their face, okay? So typically in the Vietnam War, the camouflage face paint that was used was these camouflage sticks, okay? So if you focus in right here, it says paint face camouflage stick form, all right? Now if I open that up, it's got camouflage paint on both sides. One side is like a light green, and another side is a loam. And what you would do is you would put the darker colors on prominent places of your face, such as the nose, cheeks, forehead, and chin, and fill in the you know, concave areas with the lighter colors. That's typical face paint, you know, techniques. But hey, Vietnam, you know, guys kind of did whatever they want to do. Obviously, when we were doing the LERP video, we saw a whole bunch of different conglomerations of camouflage face paint techniques, and so, you know, whatever those guys did, it was on them. It was their specific unit SOPs. But that was the camouflage face paint that was used in Vietnam, and no doubt was used by the MACV-SOG guys before going into the bush.
So let's talk about web gear, in particular the M1937 BAR belt. Now, these would come in two shades. You could sometimes find these in tan or in what would be produced after that in a green pattern, like a Korean era BAR belt. Now, BARs, among a lot of other old World War II weaponry, was being issued out to indigenous troops. And obviously SOG had access to that. So a lot of those American troops of SOG would take these bar belts for themselves and utilize them. And they liked these because they carried a lot of 20-round M16 mags. Through much of SOG's life, up until later on in the war, 20-round mags was all that they had for the M16. That was the standard magazine. So, and even later on, 30 rounds were in short supply. So they may have a 30 round in the weapon for each team member, but they still had a bunch of 20s to supplement that 30 round mag with, and those would fit perfectly in this belt. So let's look at this. Basically, you could get 3 20-round magazines neatly and nicely into each BAR pouch. You guys can do the math. There's 6 of those times 3. That's 18 extra magazines, extra 20-round magazines that you've got right there on your belt. Now, how do you carry other gear on this belt? Like canteens, for example. Well, they've got these grommet holes in the bottom, and you can use the old attachment system here, like you can see on this canteen, to attach those. Also, you could attach a bayonet, or whatever you wanted to put on the bottom of here. If we look at this example, we've got a canteen pouch, but it's loaded down with 20 round M16 mags. This could also be filled with grenades or M203 rounds, whatever that they wanted to carry using this older type attachment system. In terms of the harness that you could wear, here's an M56 standard Vietnam issue harness, and these were usually laden down with pouches. You could put your knife on here. You could repurpose gas mask pouches. You could use tape to tape whatever you wanted to, and those guys really loaded these harnesses down. Now here's an example of an older harness. This is the M1945, but this would have been something that would have been issued along with the bar belt going to the indigenous troops and could have easily been repurposed by members of SOG. While a lot of SOG members used the bar belt, most of them used what was commonly available to all U.S. troops during the Vietnam War, the M1956 web gear setup. So let's have a look at this. This was made out of canvas almost throughout in the beginning of the war. As things progressed on, you start to see some small parts of this being made out of nylon, like this trim of the pouch, for example. But for all intents and purposes, they serve the same purpose and they work the same. This belt is set up fairly much in a very conventional manner, but this was a modular system. So whoever was wearing this belt could change out the pouches and place them however they wanted. And you see a lot of times, even when they can't use these clips to attach them the way that they would like to on the belt, they'll just tape it onto the gear. So let's look at this standard rifleman's pouch first. Now, this pouch was initially designed for M14 magazines, and they continued to use those throughout Vietnam for the M16 mags. But obviously you can imagine an M16 mag is a good bit smaller than an M14 mag. So what guys would do is they'd put something in the bottom of this pouch here, like a cravat, which would then press up on the M16 magazines so that they didn't fall so deep down into the pouch. Then you could just take one of these out and reload your rifle. Later on, they experimented with a shorter M56 pouch. You can see how much shorter that this one is overall, made specifically for M16 20 round mags, but it wasn't a whole lot longer after this came out that we started coming out with 30 round mags, and this went away anyhow. But throughout most of Vietnam, SOG teams didn't have a full complement of 30 round mags. They might have one or two, and then they had to deal with the 20 round mags to supplement that loadout. You've got a standard H harness here. This again standard throughout the Vietnam War, but it's got multiple little hooks. You can see there's a metal hook, attachment here. There's a cloth attachment here, and you could place a grenade on there and tape it in place. It's common to see things like this pressure bandage pouch, which was this one's got a pressure bandage inside. No, it doesn't. This one has a pressure bandage inside. You can see what that would look like, your field dressing. But they would also sometimes put a compass in these as well, because it fit a compass fairly perfectly. And so there's a military issue compass inside a pretty worn out M1956 pouch. Also, let's look at the canteen cases. So obviously canteen cases were used to carry canteens, but a lot of times those canteens were put in the rucksack, so that most of what was on this web gear was fighting gear, what you needed for the fight, much like the thought process many people have today. So you don't really need water for the fight, but you definitely need ammo. And it was common to see these canteen cases being filled with magazines. These have some blanks in them and some are empty, but you get the idea. And then they would stack these up and snap them up over the top, and they'd have a canteen pouch full of magazines. And I've seen these stacked different ways. You can tell when looking at the pictures, the magazines will start to wear on the outside of the pouch because they wear those so much, and you can see the prints of how they have the mag stacked on the inside. I've seen them done a few different ways. Another thing that they'll use these canteen pouches for is they'll fill them with grenades, or they'll fill them with grenades for the M203, under barrel grenade launcher, or the M79, and that worked really well too. So it's just common to see guys, sometimes they're only carrying canteen pouches on their M56 web belt, and everything else is either in their ruck or strapped up on the H harnesses somewhere.
M1967 gear. Okay, so we've talked about the BAR belt, we talked about the M1956 style equipment. Let's talk about M1967 gear. And what we tend to see with the M1967 gear is trickles of that equipment mixed in with the other stuff, okay? So you don't really have the M1956 stuff going out the door. What you have is introduction of M1967 style gear mixed in with the M1956 style equipment, okay? What I'm talking about that is you might see an M1956 style belt with M67 style magazine pouches or canteen pouches, all right, or the H style suspenders. You don't really see a complete setup like this, completely outfitted in the M1967 stuff. So just kind of keep an eye out that when you're looking at photos. What is the M1967 style equipment though? We look at it and it kind of reminds us of what we know nowadays is like Alice gear, right? But this is the predecessor of Alice. We see the nylon equipment, right? We see the nylon net magazine pouches and the nylon canteen carriers and H suspenders. And obviously it's replacing the canvas because this nylon equipment dries faster and is better suited for that hot, humid, wet environments that you find in Southeast Asia, all right? Also, a change on the M1967 equipment was this introduction of the Davis belt. If you come over here, Bruce, and look over here, you see it says Davis on it, but this is a quick release belt. So what I mean by that is you have this sucker connected up, okay? And just by pulling back on this lever here, you guys see it comes apart, all right? One more time, it's connected, pull back on the lever, comes apart. All right, so it's a pretty nifty little quick release setup there. But that was an implementation which replaced the M1956 style belt. These pouches here, as you guys can see, they have, just like on the M56 style pouch, they have grenade holders on each side, all right? And then they have a quick release buckle, which is different than the M56 style. And then it holds 4 magazines, 20 round magazines inside. It also has a little lever in there that you can pull to help get that first magazine out. But it comfortably fits those 4 magazines. And then again, it has a spot to hang grenades on each side. So it's very similar and reminiscent of the shorter M56 pouch that Bruce showed you guys earlier. The canteen pouch, very similar to 56 one, except it has a little pouch right here. You know, if you need to put water purification tabs in there or any other little miscellaneous survival piece, like maybe a whistle or something, you can throw it inside that little pouch. But you guys can see that these pouches are definitely a step up from the old 56 style equipment. The H suspenders, again, made out of nylon. They look very similar to the 56 style suspenders, but they do have some adjustments or some additions. These clips right here were for a pack, but you know that wouldn't have been used by SOG. We'll talk about packs here shortly. And then as you guys can see, very reminiscent of the 56 style. It has a strap that hooks onto this little D-ring here where you can adjust the gear to your specific body type, okay? If you come over here, I've got some later 30 round magazines that would come out, and again, these still have those Alice style clips to hook up to the belt, but obviously with the 30 round magazines making their way into theater and guys starting to use those and prefer those more, obviously they need a pouch dedicated to holding those magazines. So these pouches hold 3 30 round magazines, whereas these pouches held 4 20 round magazines. And similarly, as with this shorter pouch, you have a spot to hold a grenade on each side. And then it still has the strap to hook into that D-ring on the H suspender, okay? But 30 round magazine, all right? Obviously that's the way to go. But we will cover weapons more in depth here in a little bit. But that is the M1967 style equipment. Again, guys, typically don't see it all M1967. You typically see it mixed in with other previous M1956 style gear.
Miscellaneous pouches. There were many miscellaneous pouches used by SOG team. We'll talk about a few of the more common ones. If you come on in here, first of all, we've got the M2 carbine magazine pouch. Now, this magazine pouch held 30 round M2 carbine magazines. The M2 is just a fully automatic version of the M1 carbine, but this pouch could be used, repurposed to hold other items as well. The M3 grease gun magazine, just like the previous pouch, this held 3 M3 grease gun magazines, but it can also be repurposed to hold other magazines for other submachine guns as well. Now, along with this is the US issue M3 magazine pouch, but we also had CISO produced a version of this, and this was more commonly seen among indigenous troops assigned to SOG to hold the submachine gun magazines that they had for their submachine guns. Claymore pouch. This Claymore pouch held the Claymore anti-personnel mine. However, these were really popular among SOG teams to hold items other than just the Claymore. They may fill this full of magazines, grenades for the M79 or M203, or other items as well. So it's common to see these sometimes mounted on a rucksack or sometimes just slung over the shoulder as a universal pouch. Works really well for placing anything large, roughly this size, that you need to fit in here. Let's look at some first aid items, first aid specific items. So we talked about this compress dressing pouch. This has got the compressed dressing inside. Super common. You could get to this really fast and then treat an injury if you needed to treat an injury. But along with this, you've got the jungle first aid kit. This holds a typical jungle first aid kit inside, which has got multiple items inside which you can treat injuries that you may find out in the field. And these are, of course, have fasteners on the back so you can hook it to different types of belt systems that you may encounter. This is a waterproof match case. Now this came out of like a pilot survival kit, but what SOG liked to do was they would put their morphine syrettes inside here, and then that way they were able to keep those protected from the elements, but access them quickly if they needed to. Another item that you may see is this albumin serum can, and this is just a metal can, like a tin can that your food would come in, and it had on top a little key that you would use to remove the top, and inside here's a glass bottle, and this glass bottle contains a liquid that you would use like we would think of a modern IV. So if someone was low on blood, they could then give themselves this material into their intravenous system and extend their life without having them bleed out. These were really popular and really important if you're out in the field where you may be 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours away from medical attention. These could have saved a lot of lives, and you do see these carried with SOG teams and sometimes attached to their gear and equipment.
All right, next we're going to talk about some survival vests. Now, this first example I'm going to talk about here, this is kind of, again, another MACV-SOG mainstay staple. This is often referred to as a 1-0 vest. And essentially, guys, it's just nothing more of like a period fishing vest. But, you know, they would use these, and these could hold all kinds of different, you know, pieces of gear, whether it be survival equipment, radio equipment, ammunition, you know, a lot of stuff like maps. You guys can see the necessity in having a vest like this that has all these additional pockets. So again, these are typically referred to as 1-0 vests. I don't think they called them that at the time, but nonetheless, a MACV-SOG mainstay staple. And on the back here, you can see there's a couple more pockets and some zippered pouches for different miscellaneous things. But really, nothing more than a fishing vest, right? Over here, I have an example of a pilot survival vest. So obviously, you know, pilots, when they get shot down, they have to carry survival equipment on them. And this is an example of a vest that a pilot would have worn during Vietnam. And no question, some of the MACV-SOG guys would have worn this because, as you guys can see, it looks very similar, right? It has some of the kind of the same pocket configurations. So their pilots carry survival equipment. The MACV-SOG guys operating in Cambodia and Laos, they would be carrying the same type of survival equipment on them as well. And the back of this one's adjustable, and as you can see, it has pouches for different miscellaneous items. So this would probably be later war, where you had guys wearing these type of vests, and this would probably be more early and mid war operations. All right, guys, next we're going to talk about some extraction methods, but this is also going to tie into gear. So if we look over here, we have the first one, and this is kind of early MACV-SOG days. So if you listen to John Stryker Mirror, he's going to talk about how they put on Swiss seats, and they were extracted on ropes using those Swiss seats with the snap links. And essentially, you know, they made that Swiss seat, the helicopter and the bird would drop a rope down, and they would hook into that and then get pulled out that way. All right, moving forward a little bit, we have what's called the Hansen rig, and this was nothing more than essentially a A7A cargo style strap that they converted into an extraction method. All right, it would form a seat, and they would get in that, and then they would hook in, same as like the Swiss seats, kind of taking the place of it, and they would get pulled out that way. And you see this hanging on guys' rucks in some of the MACV-SOG style photos, and you know, you could bundle it up with some bands to keep it tight, and then, you know, obviously pull those and undo these when it's time to rock and roll and get out of town. All right. So the last one we're going to talk about is kind of a mainstay staple of MACV-SOG, and that's the Stabo rig. At least this is a variation of it. And the Stabo rig actually tied in to all of your gear. This was essentially a full body system. And if you guys look over here, you'll see it has these slits here, and that was to insert your actual you know, pistol belt for your web gear through those slits. And then this would take the place of your H straps, your H harness, and then you would be wearing this all the time, which is a big benefit over, you know, something like these where you actually had to prep these, right? You had to undo these, get these ready, and you know, or make a Swiss seat. The Stabo rig, you were already ready to go. And what they would do is, these are the bottom, these are the two straps that would go underneath your legs. These would just be bound up with, you know, either tape or maybe something like one of these rubber bands. And when it was time to extract, all you had to do was undo these, and then these would go under your leg and then just snap in like that. And then when that rope comes down, you could tie in and snap in to the extraction rope and get pulled out of the jungle that way. And again, this is a full body system. This is going over your shoulders. This is going underneath your legs. So even if you were to pass out, God forbid, or get hit by enemy fire as you're going up, you would not fall out because this would keep you in place. And on top of that, there was also these field modified and manufactured pads that sometimes would be added to the straps, okay, because when you're getting pulled up and this is lifting your body weight, you know, obviously these belts are rubbing against your skin, or, you know, these are tied in and these are taking the place of the H suspenders. There's not really padding here, so these would take the place of that, and you slide those over and that would give you some padding for that load-bearing equipment, as well as padding for when you're getting pulled up. So very effective and awesome little modification and upgrade to your standard Stabo rig.
So let's look at how water was carried by SOG during the Vietnam War. Now, we had multiple different canteens that were used. We're going to look at a few of those today. The most common, most popular, you guys are all familiar with this, is the standard 1-quart canteen. It's a plastic canteen. This one's actually dated 1968. And these just held 1 quart of water. There's nothing much to be said about them. Hard plastic though, not very collapsible, and they would slosh around when they were empty or getting empty. So let's look at the 2-quart. Obviously this carries twice as much as the 1-quart. This one's also 1968 dated. These came in their own nylon pouch, which had what we kind of refer to now as Alice clips on the back, so you could clip those to your belt. Same type of lid on the canteen, but this one being also 68 dated, this one's collapsible. So as you can see, it's empty now. It doesn't weigh anything. It probably weighs less than the 1-quart, and it's completely can be crushed completely flat. Also, as you're emptying water out of this, you can crush it down so that it doesn't slosh around, and that's one of the benefits of the 2-quart canteen. And lastly, we have the 5-quart. So obviously it carries 5 times what the small plastic canteen carries. This is a Vietnam era, and you can notice that this one is also a bladder that you can flatten out. It doesn't weigh very much, comes in its own nylon pouch, and this nylon pouch has these little ties, like little shoestrings on all 4 corners, so you can strap this down to a pack, inside of a pack, or whatever you needed to be able to get your water. It's probably important to note that both the 2-quart and the 5-quart have these small little pockets here so you can put your water purification tabs. And this is something that you'll see with SOG teams. A lot of times on their 1-quart canteens, they'll actually have their water purification tabs taped onto the handle or onto the canteen somewhere. So those are always going wherever the canteen goes. So real quick, let's talk about carabiners. There's not a lot to say, but this is a really common piece of equipment seen among troops in Vietnam, especially special teams and especially MACV-SOG. This is made of steel. It's plated so that it won't rust easily, although these will rust over time. You see these used on stable rigs, extraction harnesses and ropes, but you also see them used just to hold gear on equipment, hang gear off of equipment. It's a multi-purpose item. And these are fairly silver and fairly shiny. Sometimes they were painted, but not always. And I'm sure sometimes they were painted and that paint wore off fairly quickly, and then they end up looking right back like this again. They may have also been covered in tape occasionally. You would think that metal on metal would be something that SOG would want to try to prevent. However, we got lots of photos that that's not the case. These are hanging right off of a stable rig being worn out in the field, metal on metal contact. So that really just depended on probably the practice of the individual in the SOG team. But that is your standard Vietnam issue carabiner. Secondly, we can talk about tape. And this is kind of a big discussion. So there were 3 main types of tape that were available to troops in Vietnam. And this isn't just SOG specific, but this is all troops. So first of all, you've got this kind of bright Kelly green tape. Now this was a lot like, looks like duct tape of today, but it's actually a different composition, and it's not quite as sticky and it's not quite as shiny. You see this commonly used. You also have the more modern, although this was very available in Vietnam too, this color of green, almost a greenish gray tape. Now these are the same basic composition, but they're just 2 different shades, drab shades of green, and you even see these used together sometimes. So it simply came down to what the individual had available at the time, and there were plenty of camps that had both colors around and they just used them indiscriminately. And lastly, and very common, you'll have just standard electrical tape. Now this is not Vietnam era electrical tape, but the stuff from Vietnam looked the exact same and worked the exact same. You see this used by SOG a lot too. They'll use it sometimes to tie the pants of their legs to help keep leeches out and keep their pants from rubbing. You'll see it used over the casings of M34 grenades or smoke grenades to help break up the bright color of those. You'll see it used to hold different pieces of gear onto their chest harnesses or their H harnesses. And here's a couple of examples of that. We've got black electrical tape around the grip holding the trigger guard down. You see this practice probably more than you guys would think. If you look closely at pictures, the ones that are in focus where you can see it, there are SOG team members that would sometimes just tape that down so that it didn't rattle for personal preference or whatever reason. And here's some tape of the green type just around the handguard, just to keep the 2 halves of the handguard from coming off. But they could use this for taping cleaning rods to the rifle or any multitude of purposes that they felt the need just to use some tape while they were out in the field.
All right, guys, next thing I want to talk about are pistol holsters. Now, generally speaking, MACV-SOG guys didn't carry pistols. There were some that did, okay, and that's why we want to go ahead and talk about some pistol holsters. But generally speaking, most of the team members would have opted to carry extra magazines or extra grenades, okay? Because there's a lot of weight associated with carrying a pistol. But nonetheless, let's go ahead and talk about some of the ways to carry pistols. We're going to talk specifically about the pistols used by MACV-SOG later on in the video, but let's talk about actual methods, okay? Now, this is your standard M1916 holster, okay? Now, I don't think there's any pictures floating around where MACV-SOG guys are carrying these, but this is your typical holster of the era to carry the M1911 style pistol. Okay, so just because there's no pictures floating around doesn't mean that it wasn't used, but obviously these were prevalent in country and would have been a method for guys to be able to carry that M1911 style pistol. or the Browning high power that we're going to talk about later, okay? But this is used with wire hangers and just can attach to any standard pistol belt. And some support gear for that would be just like this. Your 1911 magazine pouch holds 2 7-round M1911 magazines, okay? So that's your typical M1917 holster. Again, no photographic evidence that I've seen supports any MACV-SOG guys wearing this. However, it was the pistol holster of the era, so it just doesn't mean it wasn't used at all, okay? It could have been used. That is definitely a means of carrying a pistol. Probably more prevalent though would have been something like this, a shoulder holster, okay? And as you guys can see in here, I have a Browning high power stuffed in here. So this is made for a M1911. However, that Browning high power pistol that was used by SOG more often than an M1911 does fit in this shoulder holster. So this is another means. Probably one of the most common means of carrying a pistol would have been just a like 550 cord style lanyard around the neck. All right, they put it around the neck and they stuffed it inside the shirt. I know that sounds crazy to a lot of people nowadays, but it was definitely a method of carrying that pistol back in those days, okay? And that was definitely a method that was used by MACV-SOG.
Rucksacks and packs. So there were two most common types of rucksacks or packs used by both SOG and the indigenous troops that supported them. So probably the most common throughout the war was the CISO pack, and that is what this is. These were made of canvas material. If you notice, it sort of looks like, from a distance, a pack that an NVA soldier would wear. These were impregnated with a material to help repel water, and this would wear over time. This is actually a really nice example. 3 main big pockets, just like the NVA pack would have. It's got extra places to put extra gear, okay? So you could run a carabiner through there. Sometimes pot flares were put in there. Sometimes other pouches were attached onto the outside of it. It's got a map pocket here against the back, which you could use to hold whatever you want. It didn't have to be a map. Reinforced straps, and it actually even has a belt system on it, although a lot of times these were cut off. This is just a really nice example of that pack. And again, these were made by CISO, and they were really made to look like a local pack that the NVA would be using. These would come in 2 colors. Sometimes you'd see them in this sort of dark green, and sometimes you would see them in more of a tan color. Let's look at a couple of reproductions. So here's a reproduction that you can see has been oversprayed with black spray paint. That was common, as was any of the gear that MACV-SOG might have used, including the uniforms. We've already talked about that. Modifications, you may see something like shoulder pads added to the straps of these. These would have been made locally in country and then just attached to the shoulder straps to give a little extra padding there. Turn this reproduction around, and you can see these pouches would hold canteens, and a lot of times they did hold canteens for MACV-SOG. That way their fighting belt could be loaded down with ordnance and magazines, and the water, which would typically only be needed for longer sustainment type fights, would be on the rucksack itself. This one I've got a carabiner, which we've talked about, and I've actually got a gas mask bag full of personal items as well that would just fit right on to these attachment straps using these Alice style clips. Now, lastly, US packs were also used later on in the war. The tropical pack became available, and it was liked among SOG teams as well. It's got the same 3 big pouches of the CISO pack that we just looked at, but it has a lot more features. It's made out of modern nylon. It's a better quality pack. It's lighter weight. It's got a metal X frame on the inside to give extra rigidity to the pack. One of the things that the CISO packs really lacked, a lot of times SOG teams would load these down with gear. When you load one of these down with gear, they're more comfortable a lot of times if you have some type of stiffener to help keep the pack rigid. Adjustable straps, nylon straps, just a much more modern, a much more desirable pack that you see starting to show up among SOG teams late in the war. So let's talk about the chest rigs that were sometimes used to hold extra ammunition for both the CAR-15 or M16 and the AK. So we have two types of those here. First, this is the CISO produced. Again, here we are back with CISO. M16 magazine pouch. This will hold 6 30-round magazines. We think there were some that only held 3, 1 per pouch, but this one holds 6. There seems to be photos of both. There were some slight variations of these. This is a canvas strap. I've seen some that appear to be nylon shoulder straps. We've oversprayed this one with black spray paint, and this is a reproduction. I don't know that there are any originals in existence. Maybe some of you guys know, and if you know where one is, we'd love to see it, because all the collectors I've talked to have never seen an original, but we've got photos of them, so we know that they did exist. And these just have a simple metal snap button, and you can pull out your 30-round magazine, and there are 2 of those to fit with the CAR 15 or M16 series of weapons. Now, following in the direction that CISO goes, here's a Chicom or NVA chest rig for AK-47 magazines. And you notice that from a distance, those would look very similar. We've got 3 big pockets up front. This is what would be showing on the chest of the person that was wearing it. And it's kind of a tannish green color. Would look from a distance like something that the CISO would look from a distance like something that the NVA was wearing. Now this is designed to hold 3 30-round AK-47 magazines, which we've got here, but we've also got, you can put 2 30-round M16 magazines in here. So that would be, you could carry 2 of those for a total of 6. Now typically M16 magazines are smaller and shorter than AK-47 magazines. So in the bottom here could be a block of wood, it could be a bandage, it could be something to fill up that space so they didn't go too far down. And even when they're in this, they're relatively tight. I'm having a little trouble pulling that out, which is one of the reasons why you see SOG teams develop this sort of mag pull technique where they would run paracord through this magazine so that you could grab a loop of paracord and pull the magazine out. That worked in both belt mounted pouches or chest mounted pouches like this. I also have to mention that there were a lot of times SOG teams would carry foreign weapons like the AK-47. That's particularly true with the indigenous troops. So this was a chest rig that you see used a lot of times really by both American troops and the Vietnamese or Montagnard troops attached to the SOG team.
All right, moving on. Next thing we're talking about are gas masks. So I know a lot of you are probably thinking, why on earth would a recon team need to wear a gas mask? Well, for very good reason. The enemy would often use CS against them. They would use that tear gas. So they would need those protective masks for defense against that. They also carried it themselves to use against the enemy. So there was a lot of reasons for using these gas masks. I have 2 gas mask examples here. So this is the kind of the standard Army issue M17, and you guys can see this is kind of bulky, right? It's a large mask. It was probably the best offered protective mask of the time, but it comes in a a leg carried. The strap goes around the hip, and then this attaches to the leg, and it was in this big bag. So it's not too practical for a recon team to carry in country, when you're moving over, vast terrain and arduous terrain, especially in a triple canopy jungle, okay? So later, you had the XM28. Now this is a lot smaller. You guys can see the size difference. And it's a lot more portable, a lot more compact, and I'll show you guys the pouch here in a second, but as you can see, it's just a more compact mask. It's often referred to as the grasshopper, as you can see, because of the way it looks, but this offered essentially, the protection you needed to protect yourself against, enemy riot control agents, as well as, if they were deploying it themselves. It was carried in a little small convenient pouch like this, and this could be mounted on something like this H suspenders that I have here, okay? But you can attach this to your pack. This could mount just about anywhere. Very modular little pouch here. But that's pretty much it in a nutshell, guys. This is the XM28, and this was the M17 gas mask.
So let's talk knives, blades, cutting tools that were used by SOG during Vietnam. So there were quite a few. We're going to cover a few of those, some of the probably more common ones. And we're going to start kind of with, we're going to start with the pocket knife, which a lot of people don't think of that as being really a glorious blade, but pocket knives were carried by all sorts of troops in Vietnam, including SOG, just a good general purpose tool. They were really popular at the time. We're talking about the 1960s and 1970s. Everybody kind of had one. It's kind of a rite of passage to be a man, is to have a pocket knife. So we'll look at a rather large one here. Now this is the Buck 110. And this is a big boy in terms of lock blades, pocket knives, full-size handle, and a stainless steel blade. These are just really good pocket knives. They were really popular among troops in Vietnam, and you guys can kind of see why, and I'm sure that some guys in SOG would have purchased one of these or had one of these sent from home to use out in the field for their normal just field crafting, any type of field crafting jobs that they had. Next, let me say, any pocket knife that the civilians would have had on the U.S. side, they would have sent those to Vietnam, and those troops would have had access to those. So first military knife we've got here, this is a reproduction. This one's actually made by Ka-Bar, but this is what they call a Mark I. And it looks a lot like what we kind of think of as the stereotypical Ka-Bar today. Leather sheath, leather handle, but it's got some differences. It's smaller overall. It's got a smaller blade, no blood groove. And these are really popular. These were used really common in the Navy, and they would have been traded or bartered for with SOG teams, and those guys would have been able to acquire those and use those. And that's just a good common knife that we see a lot of in Vietnam. Secondly, we can get over to the Ka-Bar, or what we think of as the Ka-Bar. These were actually made by different companies. This is a Mark II. This is in a fiberglass scabbard, much like the bayonets at the time were. And that's a great scabbard because you don't have to worry about your blade cutting through that scabbard if it's being used harshly while it's on your gear. Leather scabbards, sometimes the blade would cut through or would get damaged more easily than these hard fiberglass scabbards. We'll just have a look at this blade here. You can see this one's well worn, but you got a blood groove. It's a much bigger blade than the Mark I. Stacked leather handle. Let's look at this knife. Now this is a Marine Corps issue. There we go. Marine Corps issue. Mark II, Ka-Bar. This one's made by Camillus. See the markings there on the end of the blade. Same construction as this knife, just a different scabbard. These were made by several different companies during the time or just before the Vietnam War. This one's in oxblood, what they call oxblood leather, which maybe to you guys looks like it's black, but it's really a really dark brown. And that would have been period correct for the Vietnam War. But here we've got just a regular old bayonet, M16 bayonet. These were common. Everybody had access to them. This is your M7 bayonet. This one's like in mint condition, really, really nice. Also came in the hard fiberglass scabbard, very similar to that Mark II. Just a smaller scabbard for a smaller blade. These did not make very good field knives. They're really not good for much other than sticking people with bayonets. They weren't as common among SOG, although you might see them just because they were available. A pilot survival knife. Now these were really popular among SOG, and we've got two examples of them here. This one was going to be more early war because it's got a full leather sheath. And remember how we talked about sometimes knives like to cut through the leather sheaths? Later on they started adding an aluminum plate on the end of the sheath to keep that blade from cutting through. This is a modern one, but it's the same as the ones that they would have had in Vietnam. We'll just have a look at that blade there. Smaller blade, more like the Mark I. Nice thick steel blade, blood groove. These were really good knives, and SOG must have had access to a lot of them because you see them used quite often, especially among indigenous troops, but also with U.S. troops. So let's look at the SOG knife itself, the Legend itself. So these are both reproductions. These are highly sought after for collectors, and there's a lot of history behind these, but we're going to keep it brief today because we've got so much to cover. But these knives were initially contracted and made in Japan. They made their way to some SOG teams, and they have since the war just become known as the SOG knife. There were different variations of these. Some had sterile blades with no markings, some had manufacturing markings, and some were completely engraved and given as presentation pieces to SOG members and some members of other special teams as well, different special forces groups. The most common ones that you see are marked and were presentation pieces. Most of the ones that were actually used out in the field were just used up or lost at some point, and we just don't have access to those anymore. There's not a lot of those out there available for collections, collections, but there are some. But this is a good example of a reproduction, and if you'll notice this one, you've got components of it that are made of darkened aluminum or steel, and then they're also common to see them with brass components as well. These were cast brass and then just finished off after that. We can have a look at these blades. So each of these will have a sharpening stone inside, although sometimes these were removed. The pocket for the sharpening stone was removed so these could be taped on the gear. And a lot of times they were worn upside down like this. And as you can see, it's not hard to think that this could possibly become lost. Look at that. Could possibly become lost out in the field pretty easily. And it's not uncommon to see these scabbards with SOG teams with K-bars or Mark IIs inside, because the scabbard was attached via tape and a rope to the gear, and the knife fell out and they had to replace it with something, and they put a Mark II knife in here. That's not uncommon. These would get lost in the field, or a lot of times handed down to other SOG team members as the previous owner of the knife rotated out. Let's look at the Woodsman's Pow. Now this is cool. Go ahead and look at the markings here. It says Survival Axe Type 4. The manufacturing number and a mill number on there. I believe John Stryker Meyer said he carried one of these out in the field. And that would be a great, very heavy blade, very thick. Be great for multiple types of uses, including dispatching an enemy if you had to. That is a serious piece of equipment right there. But heavy. I guess the downside is it's rather heavy. And we'll look at the two machetes as well. We've got, this is more of an earlier war machete. This is more of a later war. Later on, they put drain holes in here so that the water would be able to drain out and wouldn't just hold inside and rust the blade out. But these are just, it's a 66 dated scabbard here. Probably started seeing these closer to 68 and thereafter. But yeah, just typical machete. Great for doing any kind of chopping of vines or chopping down any wood or splitting anything that you needed to split. I've seen guys cut complete trees down with these to create areas for helicopters to come and land. So multi-purpose tool that you might have seen some SOG guys use. Probably don't think about SOG guys carrying a lot of machetes, and that's probably true, but there's always an exception to the rule, and I'm sure at some point some guy would have carried this out in the field for some special purpose.
So when you're talking about reconnaissance, and that's what MACV-SOG generally did, you need binos, right? So, you know, one of the things they did is they monitored the Ho Chi Minh trails. So what did they carry in terms of binoculars? Well, first and foremost, they, in early years at least, they probably carried some World War II, Korea, early Vietnam era binoculars, probably like the ones you're seeing here. But the thing is those are gonna be a lot heavier binoculars, okay? So a lot of guys did private purchases for some civilian binos. And one of the most common ones is gonna be the Bushnell Featherlight binos. And I've got an example here, okay? And these are extremely light. I don't know what the weight is on them, but they're way lighter than your typical military binoculars. Now, are they going to be built as tough as military grade binoculars? No, probably not. However, you know, ounces equal pounds and pounds equal pain, right? So I know a lot of those guys would probably opted for the lighter weight binoculars, and these are definitely light. So again, guys, these are the Bushnell Featherlight binoculars. Now let's look at another military option. This is a later war M19 style binoculars. Okay. And I'm sure that these were common in the later war, but this would have been like the latest and greatest set of issued binoculars for MACV-SOG, particularly in the later war. And these are 7x50 is what it says on here. All right, so if you're checking out the enemy through your binos or you're seeing them, you're obviously going to want to record what you're seeing. So they're going to need to write that down on some sort of notepad and some sort of pen, but this was the issued notepad and pen of the time, of the era. So I'm not saying that they would have used this specifically, but it would have been something along these lines. Some sort of notepad and pen to record what exactly they're observing, so that when you go back to hire and report on the enemy's actions on the Ho Chi Minh Trail or whatever they're observing, they can write it down.
So SOG cameras. This is the SOG camera that was used by SOG, made by Olympus in Japan. This is the ES-2, the Olympus pen. It's a 35mm camera. This would have been used to document, photograph things along the Ho Chi Minh Trail that they were watching, proof that there were vehicles or movement, whatever information they felt that they needed to take photos of and document to send back for hire to review. This would have been the camera that they would have used. So land nav and timekeeping. We're going to look at a few tools that SOG would have used regularly to both keep up with time and do navigation. Now, first of all, let's look at this Seiko watch. It's a Seiko 5. This is a reproduction watch. It's an original band, but it's a reproduction watch. It is very similar to the originals that were out there. The originals, they did not have a day counter. They just had a date counter, and the hands were a little different. But other than that, they look the same. They're highly priced today, and they're fairly expensive to purchase one. But you can still buy a watch like this, a reproduction made by Seiko, that is a rather good watch. Now, what's interesting about these is that these are self-winding. So there's a counterbalance inside, and these don't take a, you don't have to wind them, and you don't have to, they don't take a battery. So you never have to worry about changing out a battery. But as you walk, this watch goes back and forth. It's winding itself using that counterbalance on the inside. So that's a pretty interesting tool. The numbers and the dials are self-luminous, so that you can see those at night in low light as well and tell what time it is. Now this watch, or watches similar to it, SOG also used, they weren't just stuck with this watch. You could also see them with civilian watches. You could also see them with military style watches. But these watches were also often seen in conjunction with the wrist compass. And the wrist compass is just that. It's a wristband with a small compass on it that tells you whether you're headed north, south, east, or west, or somewhere in between. And this could be removed and put on a watch band. And a lot of times SOG wore those so that they had a watch and a wrist compass on the same band on one arm. Now, if you needed something better than just a general direction, this is your military issue linostatic compass. This one is early 60s dated. And it's just an all metal or metal housing. And any of you guys in the military would be familiar with this compass. They really haven't changed much over the years, but this will give you a much more accurate reading as to which direction you're headed, and it's got some other features that will let you better land nav if you're needing to be really specific about where you're heading. And these could be carried in a first aid bandage pouch, or on a piece of paracord around one's neck or in one's pocket, or wherever someone wanted to place this. And while you're reading your map, obviously light discipline may be a serious concern for the team. So here are two Vietnam era pin lights, and these were pretty simple in the way that they worked. On the end of each one, you've got a filter. So you can turn it on, and you've got white light, or we can slide this filter around and we got red light, so that we can read in a very small beam of light. You can look at your map and navigate by your map at night, or anything else that you needed to look at where you wanted to use a very small amount of light that might not be seen by the enemy. So the last piece of navigation equipment we're going to talk about is a map. SOG teams were issued a map of the AO, roughly covering the area of the mission and to the mission only. So they wouldn't have full maps that would show large portions of Vietnam, but rather just the target area only, so that if those maps fell into enemy hands or were taken off of a dead body, then the information that would be on that map that would fall into the hands of the enemy would be minimized.
So signaling, had these guys signal oncoming helicopters or adjacent units. So I've got a few different things laid out. All these can be used to indicate some sort of signaling. First and foremost, let's talk about the SDU-5E. And this is essentially a strobe light. This is not like your modern day strobe lights that have an IR cover or filter on them. So these can be seen by the naked eye. So have seen, particularly with the LRPs, they would drop this down the barrel of their M79 grenade launchers so that the strobe is only projected upwards, and it can be seen by pilots above. But this is a very common device. You may see this pouch commonly attached to MACV-SOG gear, and you guys can see something like an H harness or something can slide right through the back of that, and then that pouch, or I've also seen these on knife sheaths, and the pouch, the strobe goes right into that pouch, very easy and convenient, and that was commonly used. Another common device, a signaling mirror. And this is essentially just redirecting the light at an aircraft so that they could see it from the ground. And it has a little aiming apparatus in there that you can, use to direct that mirror's reflection at the pending aircraft. Another thing, very common with SOG teams, pin flares. Now I'll pull this out. This is a pilot survival pin flare signaling kit. And essentially what you have here is you have an actual firing device, and then you have these little pin flares that you would screw on the end of this firing device, and you would pull back this little lever and it'd fire those pin flares up into the air. Okay, so you don't have a large flare like the one I'm going to talk about here in a minute. It's just a small man-portable pack that every single operator on the team could carry. And these are great for signaling, incoming aircraft that are coming to pick you up, or signaling, close air support that's coming in maybe to save your ass. All right. So on top of the signals, there's also these. These are parachute flares, and essentially you would take the end cap off, attach to the bottom, and then orient it in this manner, hit the bottom, which would launch that flare up into the sky. So obviously this one's already been expended. Otherwise, there would have been a flare launching up into the sky. But this particular one is a White Star parachute, so that's going to give some illumination, but these are great for signaling adjacent units. Another signaling device, this is just a flare designed for a 40mm grenade launcher, i.e. your M79s and later M203 models. Okay. Over here we got smoke. So a few different colors here. I got white smoke, got red smoke, yellow smoke, and then we even have these little mini smokes. And you'll commonly see these attached to MACV-SOG teams is web harnesses, particularly on the H harness. And it's just a smaller, smoke, so you don't have a large smoke canister. You got these mini smokes. So those obviously come in handy. But that was something that was specific for those MACV-SOG recon teams. Typically what these guys would do is when the bird's coming in, they would pop smoke. The helicopter crew would identify which smoke they see, and they would let them know, hey, yeah, that's the right smoke, come on in. The MVA obviously knew that was their SOP, so they would pop their own smoke trying to fool those helicopters, and that's why when those birds are coming in, the MACV-SOG teams would not tell them what color smoke they pop. They would wait for those pilots to identify their smoke. Unfortunately, many helicopter crews were lost in Vietnam because the enemy knew that trick, and they would often fool those pilots into flying into the wrong LZ to pick those guys up. Last signaling thing I'm going to talk about here is we got an air panel. So an air panel, as you can see, it's in this olive drab pouch, but when you roll it out, It's just a sleeve, and it holds this very bright orange fluorescent color. And this is a full size air panel, but a lot of times the MACV-SOG guys would cut the panel down so that they had a smaller panel, okay? Or they would just sew one in the top of their boonie hat like you saw earlier. But this is a nice, easy, nifty, very lightweight, large panel that can be used to mark an LZ for a bird coming in. So that's essentially your means and methods of signaling for not just MACV-SOG, but essentially any recon team in Vietnam during that time.
Rations. So rations were not much different from LRP teams, so we'll just talk about those real quick. Most of the time, SOG guys will say that they just got stuck with C-rats, the same C-rats that regular infantry got. So it would come in a cardboard box like this. This would be an individual meal, and inside here you would have some cans and possibly some cellophane bags of some different types of food which you could eat and would make up an entire meal, that one C-rat would. You also had LRP rations, which I know some SOG teams had access to, and this was sort of a predecessor of what we think of today as our MRE. And it was really kind of the same thing. Maybe a freeze-dried main dish, which you could hydrate with water, and then a couple of other snacks in there and small things also. But these were much easier to carry than canned food, which was already hydrated and was more heavy. And also we have to kind of mention that there were indigenous meals too, which were really recipes catered towards the indigenous troops. So usually rice and some type of fish or some type of meat. And they would, of course, have those available to them at times too. It really just came down to what was available to the SOG team at the time. That's what they ended up getting issued and getting stuck eating.
Probably one of the most important pieces of gear to any reconnaissance unit, comm, right? So let's go over here. What was the primary means of radio communication with MACV-SOG? And that is going to be your PRC-25 and later PRC-77 radios. As you guys can see, it looks like a big giant brick. But these radios, you had a handset that attached to it, all right? And then you could also swap out the antennas for different lengths. And these would generally, or different range, I mean. These would generally be kept inside your indigenous rucksack for those recon teams. You know, typically when you see grunts, regular grunts walking around, you know, they had them attached to frames or, you know, one of these harnesses. But in terms of the MACV-SOG recon teams, generally what you see, they're shoved inside a rucksack along with the other mission essential gear. Okay, moving on, we have the pilot survival radios. And these would be kept inside, you know, pockets on the utilities or maybe inside a 1-0 vest pocket or something along those lines. But this is the URC-10, and as you can see, it's got a telescoping antenna. And then this would later be replaced by your PRC-90 style radios. And these have an antenna that's folded up, and you can unfold it there. But you could utilize these radios. They could talk with, you know, Cubby or, you know, CAS that's coming in to help and support for prairie fire emergencies. They could do a lot with these radios. Next radio I'm going to talk about is your PRT-4 and PRR-9 squad radio. Now, these aren't probably as used as much, but they were kind of like an inter-squad comm, inter-squad communication. And my understanding is that these were essentially one-way radio. So it's like you had guys with the receivers, and then you had one guy with the actual transmitting portion of that radio. But nonetheless, these were definitely used for recon teams in Vietnam and probably used by MACV-SOG teams at times. All right, guys. SOG teams often got some of the most high-end stuff there was available. Essentially, they were test beds for a lot of gear. Some of this stuff was cutting edge at the time. Obviously, nowadays it's like, whoa, what the hell is that? And they didn't carry all this all the time because it's not that practical, but it was available and may have been used on certain ops. So first and foremost, we're talking early adaptations of night vision. All right, Gen 1 stuff. This is a PAS-2 night vision device. Now, you can use this how I'm holding it right now in a handheld method, or this can actually mount on to both an M16 and an M14 rifle. So there is that possibility of using this. But this is early generation 1 night vision, guys. And this stuff really essentially required a lot of ambient light. So what I mean by that is either an artificial IR light source or, you know, like a full moon, so that you have lots of ambient light in the atmosphere, and that you could, the more ambient light you had, the better you could see with this Gen 1 stuff. Okay, moving on, here's a smaller handheld device. This is the PAS-6 Metascope, and this right here is actually essentially an IR illuminator. And essentially what you would do is attach these two pieces together, and you could turn this on and use this as a handheld, essentially night vision scope. This is also used for detecting enemy IR light. Okay, so if the enemy's using IR light, again, this is Gen 1 stuff, and you know, the Russian advisors were there helping the NVA in Cambodia, in Laos, and you know, you could use this and find that IR light if the Russians were using that night vision. Back in those days, those early Soviet tanks, they had big IR headlamps on them for their night vision capabilities, and this is one method you could use to detect that, all right, with the Metascope. So how often were these things used? I don't know, but they were definitely available, okay? And this had a nice little convenient pouch where the two components could go inside this, all right? Buttons up, and then it clips on with, you know, what we call Alice keepers nowadays, all right? Third thing I want to show you guys, there were several different variations and iterations of this type of equipment used during the Vietnam War, okay? But this is a seismic intrusion device, and again, there was different models of this stuff, but you know, there was also seismic intrusion devices that were thrown out of aircraft in behind enemy lines in Cambodia, in Laos, along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. You know, SOG teams might be tasked with recovering those items. But this is just an example of, you know, something that's used to detect seismic activity, all right? So if you were to properly place these and put these probes in the ground and set these up, it would detect the vibrations in the ground from enemy foot traffic and relay that information back to some sort of you know, host device. So there was, like I said, several different units and variations of this type of technology and equipment utilized, and certainly I'm sure MACV-SOG had a hand in playing with some sort of seismic intrusion devices used along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. All right, weapons of MACV-SOG. So what did they use? What did they take into the field? Because anytime you're talking special purpose troops, reconnaissance teams, you tend to have different type of weapons that are carried that are different than what the average infantryman's carrying. So let's take a look at those. Now, first and foremost, from the onset, they wanted to have weapons that generally could be claimed as not being American, or they were so plentiful in Southeast Asia that, you know, it's not outside the realm of possibility that, you know, those weapons would be carried by people that other than Americans. And one example of that is the M2 carbine. So the M2 carbine, which was essentially a select fire variant of the M1 carbine that was used heavily in World War II, this was very plentiful in Southeast Asia. We provided the South Vietnamese with many of these, and because it was a smaller carbine rifle, it was more suitable for the indigenous personnel. So this is very prevalent. You typically saw this in the early years of Vietnam, both with advisors and with the early MACV-SOG teams. And obviously it was favored by indigenous forces because of its small weight. If you get a little size comparison over here, this is your 30 caliber carbine ammunition. This is a 45 caliber pistol round, and this is a 9mm caliber pistol round. So you guys can see, you know, the size in the actual bullets themselves. All right, next I want to talk about submachine guns. So I have the M3 grease gun out here. So the M3 grease gun is just one of many submachine guns that was used by MACV-SOG. And some other variants of submachine guns were the Swedish K, which Swedish K was not an American-made submachine gun. That's why it was preferred. And then you had like the Model 76 once the Swedish K started drying up, because it kind of got revealed that we were using those in Southeast Asia. You also had, you know, venerable submachine guns like the Thompson, the Sten, and then more modern submachine guns like the Uzi were also utilized. One specific thing with MACV-SOG though, as you see, is that a lot of these submachine guns would be suppressed. Okay, so that would be one of the reasons why you would take a submachine gun into the jungles on these very dangerous reconnaissance missions. All right, but more than all of these, the #1 used weapon would be the XM177s that Bruce is going to talk about.
Okay, so rifles and carbines that SOG carried. We're just going to kind of start with the rifles first, the M16 rifles. So the M16 rifles had 20-inch barrels. This was the first one that was probably readily available to SOG, and this is the XM16E1. This was an experimental prototype carbine or rifle that was available, and it was a rather well received full-length barrel. Pretty common to see them, and this would have been more common earlier in the war, because fairly quickly this was superseded by the M16A1. Now the M16A1 took a lot of the good properties from the XM16E1 and also incorporated some advancements that were needed based on feedback that they had received from the XM16E1 being used in the jungles of Vietnam. And so this became a very common rifle and became the standard infantryman's rifle during Vietnam towards the middle and the end of the war. But this was also used by SOG and can commonly be seen carried by SOG troops, particularly the American troops. Again, full-length rifle, 20-inch barrel, relatively lightweight, but good velocity because you've got the long barrel. And if you notice, we put the 30-round magazine in here because as the war progressed on, these became more available, particularly to teams like SOG. But let's talk about something that some SOG team members have done, and the more that photos that I look at, the more I see it, is that they would take the lower from the M16, and this could be any of the full-size M16s. This comes off this push pin here. Then they would take the upper from an XM177, like this one, which is an E2. They would snap these together. And now what this did is this gave a more balanced rifle with a full-size receiver extension and buffer, which would slow the rate of fire a little bit. And there were quite a few SOG members that preferred it in this configuration. If you look at photos closely, a lot of times you'll see it in this configuration, a Car 15 upper with a full-size lower and buttstock. So the first carbines that came out that were readily available to SOG was the XM177E1, okay, the first variant of the 177. The XM for experimental, this was a carbine, little 10-inch barrel, collapsible stock, 2-position, open and close. And these were very, very well received, but there were some feedback that SOG and other special teams gave to Colt, saying, hey, look, there's a few things we would like to have, a few improvements. And one of the major improvements on this was we want to extend this barrel out so we can put a grenade launcher under it. So Colt did that. And the next variant, which superseded the E1, was the E2, the XM177E2. This is a good example of that. It's got some improvements based on feedback from the special teams. We have a longer barrel with a barrel collar so that we can take off this lower handguard. We could mount a grenade launcher underneath. And you will see it in this configuration quite often, so that at least one guy within the team has underbarrel grenade launcher rather than having to carry a separate grenade launcher like an M79.
Let's talk about a few special weapons that we sometimes see in MACV-SOG. Now, probably the #1 accomplice of the XM177E2 is going to be your AK-47. So they definitely would have some indigenous guys, maybe even some of the Americans, carrying the AKs. You throw that guy out on point, and again, he's wearing a uniform that looks like the enemy. He's carrying an AK. You're probably going to confuse the enemy upon first contact. So AK, obviously, it's a great weapon, particularly for its time. And this is just one variant of many different AKs that were in country at the time. But this is probably, if I was on a MACV-SOG team, would probably be one of the ones that I preferred overall, because it does have that folding stock here. So you can fold it up, make it more compact, and definitely a great variant. But nonetheless, MACV-SOG definitely had some AKs from time to time floating around in their ranks. And it fired the 7.62 by 39 millimeter round. Obviously way bigger than the 5.56. Next, I want to talk about a couple pistols. Now, again, guys, we're hitting the wave tops here. There was plenty of other weapons that MACV-SOG used. They probably used specialized suppressed pistols, but we're not going to dive into that stuff. What we are going to dive into is just, if they carried a pistol, what type of pistol would they have carried? And this was the standard issue pistol at the time. The M1911 had a 7-round magazine, 45 caliber round, but because these guys were operating behind enemy lines, and you want that plausible deniability, they would often carry the Browning high power pistol as the preferred pistol over an M1911, because it's not an American-made pistol, and it had a magazine capacity of 13 rounds. It was chambered in 9mm, and it's a high capacity pistol magazine and high capacity pistol, and this has been around since World War II, guys. A fantastic pistol. It's been used for years. It's probably still even being used in many militaries around the world because of it's such a fantastic pistol. But probably the #1 SOG pistol utilized by SOG teams was the Browning high power.
So shotties, this question comes up a lot. Did SOG carry shotguns? Well, the answer is yes and no. We don't really have any first-hand accounts of SOG carrying shotguns out in the field on missions. However, we know for a fact that they used them for base defense. And here we've got a couple of examples of those. Now keep in mind, SOG, they operated out of a base just like other troops did. And sometimes those bases came under attack and they had to defend those bases. So what we've got here is a Ithaca Model 37 in trench gun configuration. So you can see it's capable of taking a bayonet here, and it's got a big sling swivel and a heat shield. These shotguns would come in country and would be issued to all types of defensive units, but some of these would obviously end up on SOG bases. Now, there were many different types of shotguns used in Vietnam that would have been available. This is a Savage Stevens 77E. This would have been probably one of the most common shotguns used throughout Vietnam. There were a lot of these brought into the country, and this would be another example of one that could have been used for base defense. But there were other shotguns as well. There were many different shotguns that were available to troops in Vietnam at the time. There wasn't anything real standard about them, except that, to my knowledge, they were all 12 gauge.
Okay, machine guns. So let's talk about some machine guns carried by MACV-SOG. So maybe not so much early and mid-war, but later on in the war, things were getting a lot hotter and heavier. It's hard to believe, and they needed more firepower. And what those guys would do is, I have an RPD here, which is obviously an enemy machine gun, right? She's fired and chambered in the 7.62 by 39mm round, same round that the AK-47 shoots. And what the SOG guys would do is they would chop down the barrel. So they would shorten this machine gun, and they would take this with them for the same purposes of like we talked about with the AK, carrying an enemy's weapon system. They would chop down the barrel to make it lighter, and again, carry this into on their patrols with them. And the RPD, again, chambered 7.62 by 39. It feeds from a drum, or you could just let the belt hang. I don't think the SOG guys carried extra drums. They probably just had that one drum, and then it would have belts of ammunition in like a canteen pouch. But one of the things about the RPD is once you fire, you just get the belt. It just comes out the other end. It doesn't disintegrate like your standard NATO style machine guns. So, but that was the RPD, very prevalent in SOG teams later in the war. All right, the next medium machine gun I'm going to talk about is the M60 general purpose machine gun. This is the the standard machine gun for U.S. forces in Vietnam at the time. However, it's a little too big, a little too heavy for your MACV-SOG recon teams. So where you would see this is in things like hatchet forces and bright light missions, all right? When they needed that extra firepower, that extra ass. This machine gun's chambered in 7.62 by 51 millimeter link. And unlike the RPD that you just saw, this is a disintegrating belt. So as you fire those rounds, those links are just gonna fall out of the weapon and not trail behind you like the RPD. But a lot of firepower when they needed it in the M60.
So here we've got a few different calibers of ammunition. This is a 7.62 by 5.1 or 7.62 NATO. This is the round that the M60 and the M14 fired. This is the round that replaced it in the M16. This is the 5.56 by 45. And you can see it's smaller, it's faster, you can carry a lot more of them. And that was one of the benefits of that round over the much larger full-size 7.62 NATO. Now here is the enemy's round, the NVA's round. This is a 7.62 by 39 Russian cartridge. So it's got a big 30 caliber bullet, just like the 7.62 by 51, but a much smaller cartridge, more like the 5.56. So it became the intermediate cartridge, and this is what was fired from the AK-47 and the SKS, and we know SOG members use the AK-47 as well. And then just beside these, we've got a couple of handgun rounds or submachine gun rounds. This is your 45 ACP, this is your 9mm. 40 millimeter grenade launchers. Okay, let's look at variants of the M79. You had in the beginning the full-size M79. You see this carried throughout the war. A lot of times there would be indigenous troops that would carry this that were attached to SOG, and this would be their primary weapon system. That being said, sometimes SOG members, particularly Americans, wanted to be able to carry a primary weapon like a CAR-15 and an M79. So you start to see them cut down like this one, where nothing's happened but the stock has been shortened, okay? This could be just slung over his shoulder or put in a pack pretty easily and carried that way. And you've got a real short one that's been cut way down, right? This one's got the sight removed and the stock removed. Now this could be carried almost under your armpit, almost like a handgun, where they would just run some paracord through a sling loop on the stock or the grip, and then run that around their neck or across their body. And they've got this one that they can use for close-in support. Not a lot of long-range accuracy, but you're probably not going to need that if you're on SOG. Moving forward, here are some common cartridges that you would see for the 40 millimeter grenade launcher. This is the most common. This is your high explosive 40 millimeter round. This was standard diet for all of these 40 millimeter guns. This would explode and upon impact send shrapnel out to injure the enemy. This short one over here is a buckshot round. Now some guys would carry this one or a flèche round for their first fire in the M79, because this is just a big buckshot round. Up close, it was pretty devastating, both this one and flèche. And here in the center, we've got a 40 millimeter White Star cluster. This is just sends up a large illumination device that will light up the skies and will light up the ground as well, used for signaling or lighting things up at night. Let's look over here at the different carrying devices that they had for the 40 millimeter. Now, first of all, most common, they probably just used a canteen pouch and filled that up, or they might use a Claymore bag, or they might use a gas mask bag. But this was what was standard issue early in the war, which it just held 6 rounds of high explosive 40 millimeter ammunition. These are basically just bandoliers. Later on, they came out with this vest, which is obviously capable of carrying a lot more 40 millimeter rounds, as well as specialty rounds. And this would be for someone that was dedicated using something like either an M79 or an M203. So having just talked about the M79, one of the issues with the M79 is they had to be carried separately, okay? So you were either stuck with just an M79 or you had to carry 2 weapon systems separate from one another. So one of the things that came out about that was the XM148. The XM148 was a grenade launcher that was the predecessor to the M203. So those two were basically the same for all intents and purposes. The XM148 was a prototype design. A lot of production changes were made to it to make it better. And then the M203 came out just after that. That being said, SOG, we're looking for a way to attach a portable M203 or 40 millimeter grenade system to their carbine. So as we said before, they developed the XM177E2, which would then fit either the XM148 or later the M203 grenade launcher. 40 millimeter grenade launcher, and this would simply open breech. You could load in whatever 40 millimeter rounds you wanted that you were using in the M79. You can now carry that M203 or XM148 underneath your rifle and not have to carry something separate like a cut down M79.
All right, let's talk about explosives and demolitions. It's not unheard of and it's not unusual for a MACV-SOG team to carry explosives, okay? In this case, C4. And I've got some different components down here for display. We got our shock tube and M60 fuse igniter assembly. We got our crimping pliers, and we have a little container here for our blasting caps. But they would use the C4 for all types of purposes, whether they needed to blow up an enemy weapons cache that they stumbled on, or I also saw a episode with John Starker-Mayer on SOGcast where they actually used C4 to try an attempt to get some POWs, but end up blowing all their legs off and didn't quite work out how they expected, okay? But yeah, absolutely, within the teams, they'd probably be carrying some demolitions type equipment, okay? Moving on. Now, this is a mainstay staple of MACV-SOG, and no question without this, yeah, a lot more MACV-SOG operators would not be breathing right now, okay? This is the M18A1 anti-personnel mine, Claymore. And this has just been a lifesaver for them. You hear about them talking about this all the time, help break up those enemy attacks when they're compromised. Also, when they're setting in for the night or setting in some sort of defensive position, they'll set those Claymores up to plus up their security, okay? So M18A1 Claymore mine, you see on the front it says front towards enemy, self-explanatory, and the back says back M18A1 A-Pers mine, stands for anti-personnel, all right? Claymore mines are just absolutely freaking devastating. Essentially what you have, now I'm gonna open this up. The C4 has been removed from this, but you can see that it has all these ball bearings in there, prepped and ready to rock and roll, okay? So the back of this would be covered with that C4, and then how this works is you have a Claymore kit, so you get the bandolier, and then inside that kit would come one Claymore mine. You'd have your M57 firing device. Some Claymore kits would have a tester, and then you had 100 feet of firing wire. And once all this is set off, you'd simply hook it up, all right? You hook this end into that, and this is the safety bail. You swip that, you push that down, and then once you depress this, that would set off the mine, sending an electrical pulse to the mine, blasting the blasting cap that was inside, and then that would set off the mine and send those ball bearings straight into the enemy that's coming after them. Last anti-personnel mine I'm going to talk about is the M14, commonly referred to as the toe popper. And these were used quite frequently by SOG. And we've already talked about how the MVA would have trackers with dogs trying to hunt them down to essentially find them and kill them. Okay, so they would often plant these toe poppers in the ground, with the enemy trackers following them to hopefully the trackers step on these and blow a foot off and slow the trackers down. So another method that they could use to employ. These obviously have once armed, a pressure switch. So once the enemy foot steps on it, boom, goes off, just enough to take that enemy foot off.
Hand grenades. Let's look at a few different commonly available hand grenades to the MACV-SOG teams. Okay. First of all, let's talk about one of the more interesting ones. That's the M34. This is a white phosphorus grenade. There were a couple of different variations of this. These would really serve three purposes. Some SOG guys like them for that reason. One, yes, they will send off a fireball of incendiary material. If that gets on you, that white phosphorus, it will burn the flesh right off the bone. I've seen pictures of people that were hit with grenades like this, and they just had skeletal remains wherever it hit. It's rather amazing how hot this will burn. But secondly, it also puts off a gas that can be poisonous and bad for your lungs. Third of all is that it will send off a smoke cloud, and that smoke cloud can be used for a few different things. One, it can help mask your regress from the enemy. But one of the things SOG members have said that they use it for is that it would smoke up through the trees, so it would give the location of where the enemy was, and secondly, it would move with the wind, giving cast the air direction on the ground. So multi-use items, M34, just commonly known as Willie Pete, white phosphorus. So this is one of the oldest grenades in the inventory. This is the Mark II. These were leftovers from World War II in Korea. They had, by the time Vietnam came around, all been reloaded with high explosives, so they were high explosive fragmentation grenades. We gave a lot of these to Arvin, but some inevitably end up in the hands of our troops, and I'm sure SOG ended up with a few of these, although they would have been pretty rare and pretty long in the tooth by the time that Vietnam came around and MACV-SOG. So this is the grenade that replaced the Mark II. This is the M26 or M61. Now the difference between those two is the M26 came first. Sometime during Vietnam they decided we're going to put a secondary safety on these, a thumb safety, and that changed the designation of this grenade to the M61. Same thing with this grenade. This grenade superseded the M61, and it is known as the M33, but with the thumb safety, it is known as the M67. Now keep in mind, all these grenades serve together. This one was pretty long in the tooth and would have probably been pretty rare to see, the Mark II, but the rest of these, it was common to see them together, even on the same gear of a single individual SOG personnel. He may have different types of grenades, just depending on what was available to him at the time. Now lastly, this is a really cool grenade. This is a SOG specific grenade. This is known as the V40 mini grenade. Look how small that is. It is tiny, guys. It is really small. But these, obviously you could carry a whole lot of these and toss these out. They weren't nearly as effective as the larger grenades, but they're lighter and a lot easier to carry. You could carry a lot more of those.
All right, 3 last grenades we're going to talk about. So I got the MK3 offensive hand grenade. Now, a lot of these grenades that we've already shown you, they kill with fragmentation, right? This kills with overpressure. So you throw this into an enemy bunker, into an enemy occupied building, and it's going to have that concussive blast that's going to kill them, okay? That's the purpose of these MK3 offensive hand grenades. Very good for that purpose. Moving on, M14 incendiary grenade. Now what is this used for? Well, let's say they stumble upon an enemy weapons cache, maybe a truck, an abandoned truck, or enemy mortar tube, and you set this on that truck engine block, or you drop that down that enemy mortar tube, or you put that in the breech of that enemy artillery piece, and it's going to melt those particular weapon systems at that point where you put this grenade. So renders those weapon systems inoperable. The last grenade I'm going to talk about is your M7A2 riot control grenade, and this just throws out CS, tear gas, guys. If you're getting a hit with a whole ass load of MVA, you throw that tear gas out there, enemy starts coughing and gagging, you know, they don't know what the hell's going on, maybe they don't have a gas mask. That's probably going to break up their attack and give our boys the time to escape those enemy onslaughts. All right, sometimes the MACV-SOG teams need a little bit more firepower. In this case, they can take the M72 light anti-armor weapon, aka the Law. Okay, this fires a 66mm high explosive anti-tank rocket, and this is the original M72 Law, and these had some issues early on in Vietnam, which prompted the development of later variants. So you see the M72A1 and so on and so forth, and those were mainly improvements upon the Law rocket themselves, but they fixed the problems that they were having in the early days with the original M72. But nonetheless, you guys can see this is a very man-portable launcher that they can, you know, strap to a pack, put on their back, and take it, and if they need that extra firepower, they've got it. And these Laws would continue to serve well after the Vietnam War until they were replaced by the AT-4. All right, so last thing we're going to cover is MACV-SOG would sometimes be tasked with missions where they would insert enemy munitions into enemy weapons caches. And this was done as a psychological effect on the enemy. They go into battle, they attempt to fire, or they're in training, and they attempt to fire, and literally their weapon system blows up on them, okay? So what would be some of the kind of stuff that MACV-SOG would input or insert into those enemy weapons cache or put alongside the road for them to find? One of those could be like a PG-2 rocket for an RPG-2. The PG-7V rocket for the RPG-7. Here we have a Chinese 82mm mortar system. We also have some ammunition here, 7.62 by 54R, you know, commonly used in like rifles such as the Mosin Nagant. And then you have your typical 7.62 by 39, used in AKs, SKSs, RPDs, all kinds of, you know, your typical comm block weapon systems. So these are all examples of munitions and ammunition that could be inserted into enemy weapons caches, left on the side of the road along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, like it fell out of the back of a truck, picked up by the enemy, and subsequently later on used where it blows up in the enemy's face, leaving that psychological effect. Alright guys, that completes this video over the commonly used gear, weapons, and equipment of MACV-SOG. I hope you guys appreciated this video as much as we appreciated working on it. It was a big task. We've been planning for this for well over a year, guys, and we really enjoy doing these Vietnam-oriented videos because I know Bruce feels the same way I do. The Vietnam veterans don't get the respect and the observation that they deserve. Those guys sacrificed a lot, and what they came home to is just freaking despicable. And so to those guys, we appreciate you. Thank you for your service and welcome home. Bruce, what you got, man?
Yeah, let's particularly remember those that didn't make it home, those that were either killed in action or ended up missing in action or prisoners of war. You know, that's just like a terrible tragedy for the country, but there's many of them that were left over there, especially SOG members that were never found, and I know the search is still out to try to recover those remains and put an end into the story of their lives and the sacrifice that they made. We've been out here all day. Like Brent said, we've been planning for over a year for this, and every time that we thought we were ready to film, we would come up with something new that we wanted to buy to add to it. And I'm sure years from now we'll feel the same way, like, oh, there's so much more we could have added to it. The influence that SOG had in Vietnam is just never ending. It's monumental, and new stories come out from SOG all the time. And I know for one that I really enjoy learning about those sacrifices that those men made over there. And I'm so thankful to those veterans today that survived the war that are telling the stories that they experienced and the stories of their fallen comrades.
Absolutely. And I will post the link to John Striker Mayor's SOGcast in the bottom because those stories are just unbelievable. So thanks for watching, guys. And if you're interested in any of our previous Vietnam-oriented videos, we'll have that link in the description box, as well as you're probably seeing the thumbnails right now. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to leave a comment.